Look, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I had somebody that I cared about. Somebody I had to look after. And in this world, that's good for one thing: getting you killed.
I'm satisfied. And you were my purpose.
When it comes to the topic of adapting video games into other mediums, TV shows tend to have a better track record than movies. I mean, Sonic SatAM is widely considered one of the best adaptations of a game, and it came out the same year as the Super Mario Bros. Movie.
Trust the fungus.
But I do still occasionally see arguments being made that adapting a video game into a non-interactive medium is an inherently flawed idea. One such person being Benjamin Yahtzee Croshaw of Zero Punctuation and more recently Fully Ramblematic fame. Now, Yahtzee is a game critic who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and has almost 20 years worth of fascinating takes on the nature of video games as an art form.
Soma is a rather effective and well-told chunk of good old-fashioned hard sci-fi dealing with philosophical questions of identity and consciousness, and that's a hard sentiment to make funny, so I just arranged the words into the shape of a big willy for you.
One of the places he did this was in his show Extra Punctuation, which I'd like to briefly touch on. Specifically the episode, Forget Linear Stories, Give Me More Immersion Storytelling. In this video, he talks about how video games are capable of effective, indirect storytelling in a way non-interactive media typically can't.
You're not there to be spoon-fed a plot, you're there to simply exist in that setting. Turn over all the stones and piece together your own impression of how things got to where they are. There's no real beginning or end.
It's a really good video, as is to be expected from Yahtzee, but there's one point he makes that I disagree with. And not in the usual way of, oh, he wrote a slightly lukewarm review of a game I really like, but he had some valid points, so I guess I can't fault him. Lord knows if I listed all the times that happened, this video would be much, much longer. But no, this is a case where I feel like he's incorrect, and it's when he says this.
That's why it irks me whenever the media talks about how a video game is getting a Netflix adaptation, in such a way as to imply that this is some elevation of the material. It's not. It's a reduction, and you should never expect much.
It's a point that's always bothered me because I just find it way too one-sided and generalized. Yes, video games are capable of telling stories in ways that no other medium easily can, and some game stories most likely would fail in any other medium. But in the same way, there are things that other mediums are capable of that video games would find much more difficult. And I think one of the best case studies for that is in the TV adaptation of The Last of Us. Now, I'm not saying this argument would change Yahtzee's mind. If I wanted to do that, I wouldn't use The Last of Us as an example, considering his own opinions on it. But if you watch the show, you can see that it's more than just The Last of Us, but without the interactivity. But before we get into that, if you like this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. For just $1.50 a month, you'll get access to all my videos before they get released on YouTube. And you'll also get a shout out at the end of every video. Link is in the description. One of the main differences with the show is that the plot is much slower paced than the original material. The game had a number of quieter moments, but there was also a lot more emphasis on action sequences. That's not a problem, it's just the game playing to the strengths of its own medium. The setting is a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and the gameplay conveys that by having the players engage with the dangers that come with that.
Holy shit, Joel.
But the TV show conveys that same premise in ways that wouldn't easily make for compelling gameplay. For example, the first episode shows Joel and his daughter Sarah living a normal day before the world as they know it collapses. In the game, this is shown in a short couple of minutes, and the lives of these characters are conveyed through small pieces of dialogue and environmental details while the player is engaging with the game design. In the show, however, we get a whole 20-minute sequence where it's just a regular day in the lives of these characters, letting us get to know them, all while subtle hints keep popping up that society is crumbling without them even knowing. This is something that the show does a lot. Take elements of the story that the game primarily explored through immersion, honestly not entirely unlike what Yahtzee is suggesting, and instead letting us see those events play out through dialogue scenes, long stretches of time where the characters are alone and out of danger, or entire scenes where the main characters are absent and we can just see this world as it is. But nowhere is this more evident than with the show's third episode titled Long, Long Time. While most episodes of the show follow the general outline of the original story, albeit in a restructured way, this episode takes an almost entirely off-screen subplot from the original, expands it into basically its own dedicated movie, and even takes it in a new direction that the original game probably wouldn't have been able to do. To briefly summarize this subplot from the game, Joel and Ellie visit a booby-trapped town because its sole remaining resident, Bill, owes Joel a favor.
If I'm gonna do this, there's some gear I'm gonna need.
All right.
It's on the other side of town.
Bill is a paranoid loner with a rude and bitter demeanor towards anyone he very rarely comes across. After they meet, they go on an action-packed adventure together, as you often do in a video game. All the while, Bill hints at a former lover named Frank, who, because of Bill's hostility toward the outside world and unwillingness to prioritize happiness as well as self-preservation, parted ways with him on not good terms, to put it lightly. Well, Bill, I doubt you'd ever find this note, but if for some reason you did, I want you to know I hated your guts.
Well, that's how you feel. Well, fuck you too, Frank. Fucking idiot.
But as upset as Bill clearly is, he can't bring himself to open up about it, even when handed an opportunity to do so.
Look, Bill, about your buddy back there, that's a tough deal. And
We square.
we're square.
And get the fuck out of my town.
And so, with no other option left, Joel and Ellie leave Bill to spend the rest of his life alone and unhappy. Now, as a video game story, this subplot is perfectly good. It takes the player on a journey with plenty of fun gameplay sequences, while also allowing for some in-depth character development to unfold in the background. But when you watch the show, it becomes increasingly clear as the episode goes on that things are going to be a bit different this time around. The episode starts pretty much how you'd expect, focusing on Joel and Ellie making their way to Bill, played in this version by the inspired casting choice that is Nick Offerman.
And every year she gets me something thoughtful and personal. It makes me furious.
But then Bill gets introduced in a very different way to what the game did. Instead of having Bill show up in the middle of an action scene during Joel and Ellie's hour of need, we actually get an extensive introduction scene demonstrating his personality to the audience. We see that his paranoia and penchant for relying only on himself has been hardwired into his brain his entire life, even before the apocalypse, adding some reasoning as to how he was so prepared for it.
Not today, you New World Order jackboot fucks.
We get to see a little bit of him living his life alone in town, walled off and protected from the rest of the world, much like we saw from the original material. And that extra attention to backstory eventually leads to this scene.
First, my name's Frank.
Oh yeah?
That's right, we actually get to meet Frank in a manner other than a suicide note. And this opens up a brand new storytelling possibility that the game's plot structure didn't really allow for, in the sense that this lets us see a different side of Bill that we never got to see before. We learn that he can be loving and sensitive and accommodating, even if he still maintains his less than stellar social skills.
I know I don't seem like the type.
No, you do.
But what's really surprising about all of this is just how far they go with it. The first time I watched this episode, I assumed this would be a relatively brief flashback scene that would soon cut back to Joel and Ellie so that they could go on their madcap quest with Bill in the present.
Best stay right on my ass.
Can't miss it.
Knock it off.
But then it keeps going, and you slowly realize that this romantic subplot essentially is the episode. Already, this would be a potentially engaging way of telling the same story from a new perspective, trading in all the fight scenes for a more intimate and small-scale story of a couple falling in love before eventually drifting apart. And initially, it does seem like that's the direction it's going in, as the start of the relationship abruptly cuts to...
Oh, fuck you!
3 years later. The prophecy laid out by the original game seems to be playing out. Frank has become fed up of Bill's insistence on isolation and mere survival over living an actual life.
It's not a man.
You say resource management? So help me, I will run through one of your tripwires.
Anyone who's played the game will be expecting this to be the point where Frank walks out on Bill. But instead, that doesn't happen. They actually talk things out, and we get to see yet another new side of Bill. One who's willing to compromise his rules and instinctive suspicion that the world is out to get him to make the man he loves happy.
We're gonna make friends. And we will invite them to visit.
And from that point on, the episode continues developing the relationship, having them fall deeper in love with each other for over a decade. It's the polar opposite of how Bill's storyline went in the original game, but it takes advantage of the switch from video game to TV show. Because Bill is the type of person that avoids danger wherever possible, he wouldn't be a particularly strong main protagonist for an action-adventure game like The Last of Us. So he's relegated to a minor supporting character. But in the show, they can delve into the simpler side of his life, having a meal with friends, playing the piano, having deep and meaningful conversations in a way that can just be naturally compelling on its own without the need to make the audience actively participate. On top of that, Bill in the original game was kind of intentionally a bit of a one-note character. He doesn't undergo any major change or learn any kind of lesson. He's just meant to be a tragic character who's unable to be happy due to an unwillingness to actually do anything with his life or form any kind of connection. But a character who begins their story with a crippling flaw and then retains said flaw for the entire story likely wouldn't work as well for a main character as it would for a minor character you meet in passing. So in the show, he does develop, and as he opens himself up to Frank, allowing him to expand his world in the way that Game Bill apparently never did, we see how Bill's life noticeably improves. We're treated to a scene of Frank surprising Bill with a strawberry patch made from seeds he got from Joel, which he was only able to get because Frank convinced Bill to meet him.
We can help each other and get that gun out of my face.
Bill and Frank each take a bite of the strawberries after years of eating the same food over and over again. And after that taste of something they both thought was gone from their lives forever, we get this reaction from Bill. To anyone who's been watching the episode up until this point, and especially for those of us who've played the game beforehand, the idea of Bill having such a pure spark of joy like this is unimaginable, and really helps to hammer home the idea that Frank really did save his life. As does this line that comes soon after.
I was never afraid before you showed up.
It almost sounds like an insult, but it's really Bill expressing how Frank has finally given his life value he didn't even know he was missing. Frank's insistence on creating connections with other people also proves to have more practical applications than Bill would have thought. After they meet, Joel offers Bill some materials to reinforce the gate he's built around the town.
I can get you 10 spools of high tensile aluminum. Last you the rest of your life.
Then, 3 years later, the town is attacked by raiders. Bill fends them off as best he can, but eventually gets shot and only survives because of the gate's new defenses and that Frank comes to tend to his wound. Think about that. If Bill had stuck to his instincts and trusted nobody, including Frank and including Joel, he would have died that night. The raiders would have got past the fence and nobody would have been around to treat his injuries. Don't believe me? Listen to what Bill himself has to say when he thinks he's going to die and Frank is going to be all on his own.
We're self-sufficient here.
Call Joel. You can't be here alone.
And because he allowed himself to be vulnerable, Bill and Frank go on to live a long and happy life by the standards of the apocalypse anyway, until their age and health catch up to them and they pass away. And after all of that, we finally transition back to Joel and Ellie arriving in the town, only to be greeted by a final note from Bill. In the note, he talks about how Frank saved his life, giving him a purpose in the form of something to love and protect, and imploring Joel to find the same thing to make his own life worth living.
That's why men like you and me are here. And God help any motherfuckers who stand in our way.
And this is where the brilliance of this alternate take on the story really shows itself. The purpose of Bill's story in the original was essentially to act as a cautionary tale for Joel about how, for the sake of his own happiness, he needs to emotionally connect with Ellie despite how painful it may be due to who she reminds him of. Because if he doesn't open up, he'll likely end up like Bill, a sad, angry old man wasting away in a world where he doesn't matter. The show, on the other hand, tackles this point from the opposite perspective. By presenting us with Bill, a character even more emotionally reclusive than Joel, and showing how even he found a fulfilling life by finding someone to share it with, Joel eventually realizes that a way out of his misery is standing right in front of him if he only accepts it. It's examples like these for why I don't agree with Yahtzee's argument about adaptations like these. While I do think his point can be arguably correct in certain cases, my problem is that, in my opinion anyway, he takes this position way too far by stating that a TV adaptation of a game is, by its very nature, a reduction, and that you should never expect much. What bothers me about it is that Yahtzee, probably unintentionally, is conveying this idea that video games are an inherently superior form of storytelling to television or movies. I, on the other hand, prefer the notion that different art forms are, well, just that, different. A story about two gay lovers living a relatively peaceful life? Sure, an action-adventure game can show us that, for a few minutes at a time, albeit a very good few minutes, which is all it needs to be to progress the plot. But a roughly hour-long story with no elaborate set pieces and quiet chemistry and character evolution all by themselves, with not a lot quote-unquote happening. That's something I think is at least generally better suited to a different medium. Disagree with me if you want, I encourage it. But I think at the very least it's an alternate perspective that's at least worth considering. A bit like the plot of the episode, actually.